In 2007, a man placed a canoe into the sea on a fresh spring morning. With a final glance over his shoulder, he paddled out into open water. When he failed to return home that evening, his family panicked and reported him missing. 62 square miles of the vast and rugged North Sea coastline was thoroughly searched. They found the wreckage of the canoe, but no body. Searchers were puzzled at how the man had got into difficulty on such a calm sea. Years later, police would reveal the unbelievable story of what happened to that man in the canoe. The man in the canoe was John Darwin, a 57-year-old prison officer and retired teacher. When John paddled out to sea and into the unknown that day, he left behind his wife Anne and two grown sons, Mark and Anthony. John and Anne had lived in a 7-bedroomed home in a place called Canoe, which is a windswept seaside town in northeast England. The couple had worked hard over the years, saving up enough money to buy 12 small properties, which they rented out for extra income. John was always on the lookout to make a little extra money, from a snail breeding business to selling garden gnomes. He always had an entrepreneurial scheme. His wife Anne was less enthusiastic about the schemes, but she often humoured him because sometimes they did make money. Despite some of John's odd business ventures, the majority of his financial decisions were actually solid. Until now. John was about to make an unwise purchase that would steer their lives along a precarious path. John purchased 2 more houses for their property empire, but he used a credit card to finance the deposit. Debt on the credit card mounted, and they struggled to keep up with repayments. It was an intensely stressful time for John and Anne. Dreams of a relaxing retirement were slipping away. Were all their years of hard work and saving going to be ruined by this one poor decision? Pressure was rising on the couple, along with the debt notices and final demands in their postbox. Pushed by stress, John found himself on that beach, placing his canoe into the water on that calm spring day. Then he paddled out into the water and away from all his problems. With John's disappearance, the situation for Anne looked dire. With her husband missing, she was still drowning in debt. But out of the tragedy of John's loss, a ray of hope would emerge. The chair at the breakfast table where John usually sat remained empty. The house was quiet. All hope of a dramatic reappearance from John had now faded. Anne sat opposite that empty chair and waited. Staring silently out of her window, she watched as a black car pulled into her drive. She picked up her black jacket from the chair, looked into a nearby mirror, and took a second to compose herself. The church she had arranged for John's funeral was only a few minutes' drive away. People at the funeral remarked how Anne wore a lonely and fraught expression. Anne mourned for her husband, and her heart broke when she had to tell her 2 sons that their father was missing. But Anne's sons stuck by her and supported her through this difficult time. Anne's tragic story would attract media attention. She put out a public statement reflecting on how she felt. "All I want to do is bury his body. It would enable me to move on. It's difficult to grieve without bringing things to a close, but as it is, I'm in limbo." Almost a year had passed since John's funeral, when Anne received a letter. It was a certificate of death for her husband. It was a legal formality. He was no longer missing, but dead. Anne's sons had known this letter was coming. This letter squashed any hope of their father's return. The boys braced themselves for their mother's reaction. But Anne's mood remained steady, if a little sombre, because this letter was exactly what she'd been waiting for. John had a life insurance policy, and now Anne could claim £250,000, clearing her debts. John's tragedy had saved her from financial disaster. Anne was moving on with her life, but an undercurrent of whispered gossip hinted at a more sinister reason why. People expected Anne's sombre mood to continue after the confirmation of her husband's death, an opportunity to make peace with the tragedy, and in time heal. But anyone who knows grief also knows it can make you do odd things. Publicly, Anne's mood remained sombre as she collected flowers, condolence cards, spoke to the media, and met with friends and family. But her private life was completely the opposite. People noticed she had moved on from John and hadn't wasted any time doing so. Anne settled her debts with John's life insurance payout, but the spending didn't stop there. She went on foreign holidays, first to Cyprus, then to Panama. John's death was becoming lucrative. Insurance payouts, pension schemes, government payouts, money was flowing into Anne's account. Anne also started sending money abroad, large amounts of money. Her family noticed she was becoming erratic. She was grieving after all, but some people were becoming suspicious of Anne's behaviour, and she was about to make a crucial mistake, which would reopen the case of John's disappearance and focus the spotlight of suspicion firmly on her. The reception desk at the doctor's practice where Anne worked was quietening down after the early morning rush. Anne got up from her chair at the counter and quietly slipped into a back room away from her colleagues. She made a call and started the conversation in a quiet but cheery manner. We know all this because Anne hadn't been quiet or secretive enough. A work colleague overheard this phone call, and she would later report to police that she heard Anne discussing moving money abroad and selling her house. The police, now suspicious, secretly opened a case against Anne. She was now a prime suspect in her husband's death. They didn't have any concrete evidence yet, but the signs were all there. Anne's expensive holidays on their own might not have aroused suspicion, but she also sent large amounts of money abroad. Now this secret phone call that the colleague overheard confirmed she had a partner, and she was trying to hide it. It was now clear to the police that Anne knew more about her husband's death than she'd previously admitted, but time was running out for the police to do something about it. By now, Anne had recently returned from another trip to Panama and was selling her house, which was her last connection to the UK. She was leaving the country, possibly forever, escaping the police's ability to prosecute her for any crimes. The countdown to her escape had begun. On the 1st of December in 2007, the air in London was cold. The tops of the towering buildings soaked up the winter sun above the busy street below. A middle-aged man, underdressed for the winter weather, emerged from the stream of commuters and walked into the West End Central police station. Awkwardly moving to the front desk, he said, "I think I'm a missing person." It was John Darwin. He'd been missing for 5 years. But what had happened in those 5 years since he went missing in the canoe? Police were keen to find out. He said he couldn't remember a thing. He had amnesia, but his memory was coming back to him bit by bit. He said he recognised himself from a missing person poster, but he said the last thing he could remember was a holiday that the couple took to Norway in the year 2000. The media jumped on the story. It was front page news. A man who had been dead for 5 years walking into a London police station. It was a miracle. The media couldn't get enough of her story. Anne had her husband back after 5 years. The media was searching for her desperately, but they couldn't find her. She had sold the couple's house 3 months ago and moved to Panama, escaping the investigation by police. When Anne was finally found in Panama, she told the media that she was overjoyed and overwhelmed at John's return. The story went viral in the UK and around the world. The media storm around John and Anne's story was intense. The whole thing had captured the imagination of one housewife. She was totally unconnected with the case, but she was fascinated with the story, and she researched it daily. The world is full of fascinating and strange coincidences, like John and Anne's story. Still, the housewife felt suspicious. Something didn't feel right. While researching on the family computer, she stumbled across something in a Google image search that struck her as odd. The discovery of this image would be the pivotal moment in the whole case. The moment when the truth of what happened to John Darwin would finally be revealed. This housewife had typed in the words John, Anne and Panama into Google image search. A single photo stood out in the results. It came from a website called movetopanama.com. The unassuming photo showed a plain office. A property salesman stood on the right, and an older couple stood on the left. With forced smiles on the older couple's face, it looked like the photo had been a surprise. That's because it was. The photo was of John and Anne, and now it was coming back to haunt them. This photo placed John and Anne together 18 months before he had walked into that police station and said he had amnesia. The housewife gave the picture to the media. They broadcast it. Media outlets clamoured for a response from John and Anne. How could they explain this photo? This photo had caught the couple red-handed. The whole country waited for John and Anne's response. They wanted to see the couple squirm. Anne was the first to respond. She confirmed that the photo was genuine, and she added, "My sons will never forgive me." John and Anne were both arrested and confessed to the police. Because of that confession, we now know exactly what happened to John after he disappeared in that canoe. Here is the bizarre full story. After John left that beach in the canoe, he paddled further down the coast and landed on another beach. He ditched the canoe and set up a tent to hide in. Then he took out his phone and told Anne where he was. After a few days, John tired of hiding out in the tent, so the couple devised a plan. John would move into the bedsit apartment in the house that they rented next door. John then made a secret door which would give him access from the rental apartment into the family home. John would hide in the rental apartment in the day, then use his secret door to creep into bed with his wife at night. This secret arrangement was going on even when Anne went to the funeral and mourned for her husband. Anne even had to keep up the lie to her own sons. She would later have to tell them that their father was dead. She watched them mourn at his funeral when she knew he was only feet away in the house next door. As time would pass, John became confident that people had forgotten him. All John had to do was keep a low profile, but John got cocky and started taking risks. He was restless and bored hiding away from the world, so he decided to venture out back into society. To do this, John decided he needed a disguise, so he grew a large beard and stopped cutting his hair. With a hat and sunglasses as the finishing touches, John felt his disguise was complete. John would venture out of the house, running errands around town. Seaton Carew, where John and Anne lived, was a small town, and almost daily he ran the risk of bumping into somebody he knew. The disguise seemed to be working, but it hadn't fooled everyone. A tenant at one of the apartments that John owned recognised him through the disguise. Shocked, he asked, "Aren't you supposed to be dead?" John replied, "Don't tell anyone about this." Luckily for the couple, he didn't tell anyone. When asked why he didn't inform the police, he said, "I don't want to get involved." This brush with disaster didn't stop John. He became bolder. Now he did his own gardening and started shopping in town. But was his luck about to run out? A colleague of John's, who worked at the prison, was suspicious of the whole disappearance story. He didn't like John, and he also mentioned that John had never once mentioned anything about canoeing. He said a lot of the colleagues at the prison didn't believe the disappearance story either, and he said that John was only interested in money. This same colleague drove past John's house one day to see a familiar face in the garden. He said John looked like a caveman, with long hair and a big beard, but it was John all right. As he recognised him, he slammed on the brakes of his car and tried to run back and catch John unaware. But John had noticed that he'd been recognised and ran back into the house, narrowly escaping capture. This colleague was 100% certain that it was John, so he went to the police with his suspicion. In another stroke of luck for the couple, the police only phoned Anne rather than visiting themselves. She convinced them that the colleague had seen John's cousin, and it was a case of mistaken identity. It became obvious that continuing to live in Seaton Carew, a place where a lot of people knew them, was becoming dangerous. John and Anne needed to find a place where they wouldn't be known and they could live in peace, and John didn't have to hide. With this in mind, they knew they needed to escape abroad. Taking inspiration from a spy movie that John had seen, John applied for a passport in the name of John Jones, which was the identity of a baby that had died in 1950. It worked. He received his new passport and he could finally escape the UK. The couple travelled to Cyprus, and then John travelled to the USA, looking for a place to start a new life. But neither of these places suited the couple. But finally they found the perfect destination, Panama. With security and tax laws lax enough that the couple could get an investor's visa. The property and living costs were also cheap enough that they could live a comfortable life. The couple bought a small 2-bedroomed house in Panama. Anne went back to the UK to sell their property while John stayed behind. With Anne gone, John spent £200,000 on a tropical estate. He was planning to build an eco-resort. The media reported that John was also planning to run canoeing holidays from this tropical estate. John and Anne had everything worked out. They would sell their house in the UK and then apply for an investor's visa and gain citizenship in Panama. Then they could live out the rest of their lives under Panamanian palm trees. But their luck had run out. A change in the immigration law was going to shatter the couple's tropical dreams. The Panamanian government had decided to change the investor visa rules. They now required anyone applying from the UK to get their identities confirmed via the UK police. John knew his fake passport with a false identity would not stand up to this amount of scrutiny. He knew now his only option was to return to the UK. His plan was to reveal his identity, fake amnesia, and then ride out the media storm. Then when it all blew over, quietly return to his private paradise in Panama. It was a last-ditch effort to mend the couple's web of lies. As we know now, John returned to the UK, he faked amnesia, but he didn't account for that picture that was taken in the Panamanian property office that was found by that sleuthing housewife. It was that picture that proved that Anne knew that John was not dead. Caught red-handed, the couple were tried and convicted of fraud, with both receiving over 6 years in prison and ordered to pay all the money back that they stole. But arguably, the greatest punishment for John and Anne wasn't the prison sentence. Their 2 sons initially felt elated about their father's miraculous return. It wasn't long until they learned the truth. They believed their father was dead for 5 years. They even attended his funeral when he was hiding just feet away from the family home. Anne was right. Her sons have yet to forgive her. John and Anne's sons released a statement saying that they had felt like they'd been scammed and they wanted no further contact with their parents. John and Anne had traded their 2 sons for a £250,000 life insurance policy.